securing central space and preparing for a flank attack. This English opening often leads to complex strategic battles. Embracing the fianchetto, black opts for a flexible pawn structure, inviting king's side development and creating potential long-range diagonal pressure. Developing the knight to c3 establishes control over central squares, preparing to launch a pawn storm or solidify its position for a kingside assault. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop prepares for a fierce diagonal assault, aiming to disrupt white's center from a distance. Solidifying kingside space, white aims for fianchetto control and a harmonious setup, preparing to castle and join the fight for central influence. Opening the center with e5 immediately challenges white's control and seeks active piece play. Developing the bishop to this diagonal opens a crucial long-range perspective, aiming to influence the center and prepare for castling. Securing central space, while opening a diagonal for the queen creates dynamic play. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside fianchetto, white adopts a flexible stance, anticipating potential pawn breaks while keeping options open for piece development. Developing this knight towards the center firmly anchors black's control of key squares and prepares for further central expansion or piece activity. Instead of immediately contesting the center or developing the king's rook, white opts for a flexible piece placement, aiming to solidify the kingside and potentially support a kingside attack later. This knight's journey to e2 is a subtle redirection, preparing for possible pawn pushes like f4 or offering a retreat square if black's central pressure intensifies. Castling here marshals the king to safety. A crucial defensive maneuver as white's pawns storm on the kingside is a looming threat. Securing the king with castling now tidies up white's development, tucking the monarch away safely behind a pawn shield and bringing the rook into play for future action. Solidifying the center's pawn chain, this move prepares for a d5 push, aiming to challenge white's central control and open lines for black's pieces. Challenging the central foothold immediately aims to break open the position and exploit black's slightly passive setup, forcing a decision on the pawn structure. Unleashing the rook from its slumber on e8 offers immediate support for the central pawn push, a natural aspiration in this king's Indian structure that aims to crack open white's solid formation. Securing the b-file and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this maneuver also subtly discourages black's advance with b5, forcing a re-evaluation of pawn breaks. Boldly seizing central space, this pawn thrust injects immediate tension, aiming to restrict white's queenside development and potentially create weaknesses on the dark squares. It forces white to reconsider their pawn structure and knight maneuvering, a palpable shift in the battle for initiative. Expanding on the queenside with the pawn allows white to stake a claim and potentially liberate the rook, while simultaneously aiming to restrict black's central expansion. This gambit of territory for initiative might open lines, but it also creates potential weaknesses if black can manage to counterattack effectively. The long-term consequence is a dynamic imbalance. Unleashing the bishop to the open diagonal is a bold endeavor, aiming to seize control of key squares and potentially disrupt white's central ambitions. However, this placement invites immediate tactical scrutiny. Stabilizing the kingside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to prevent black's bishop from finding an active outpost on g4, creating potential tactical weaknesses down the light squares while indirectly reinforcing white's central control and preparing for potential kingside expansion or a more solid defensive setup. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the kingside, black immediately confronts the white pawn chain and aims to disrupt white's harmonious development by creating a new frontier for potential skirmishes, potentially forcing concessions in space or piece activity. Initiating a knight sortie to f4 aims to exploit the now advanced e-pawn, potentially creating an outpost and pressuring black's kingside while simultaneously preparing for a kingside attack by offering an exchange that could open lines. NBD7 subtly reinforces the central pawn chain, preparing to contest the d4 square and potentially unlock the queenside with a timely b5 push, while simultaneously offering a safe haven for the knight should the f4 square become untenable. escalating the queenside conflict. This maneuver aims to seize greater dominion over the open b-file, potentially preparing for a future pawn advance like b5 to create immediate queenside pressure and restrict black's development options. The knight's journey to f8 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to find a more active square, perhaps f6, to challenge white's central control or support a queenside initiative. This maneuver often precedes a kingside pawn storm or a regrouping of forces to prepare for further pawn advances, a subtle yet crucial step in reinforcing the center and creating a dynamic interplay of forces. A bold pawn thrust. This c5 push dramatically alters the pawn structure and seeks to seize greater territory on the queen side, potentially aiming to unravel black's defensive setup or create weaknesses to exploit. Solidifying the central pawn structure with d5 aims to deny white's queenside expansion further and create a robust pawn phalanx, though it does commit black's central pawns and might invite pressure on the e4 pawn. Opening up the queenside with a pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and exploit the now exposed kingside pawn structure, potentially creating dynamic play and long-term weaknesses. Opening a dialogue for the knight's journey. 15. N8 h7 aims to reroute the piece from its somewhat passive post on f6, seeking active squares and potentially challenging white's growing space advantage on the kingside and center. The knight, currently tucked behind its pawns and not contributing much to the central battle, embarks on a strategic repositioning. This maneuver anticipates a potential kingside assault by white, particularly with moves like b4, b5, and the potential for a pawn storm. By moving to h7, the knight prepares to hop to g5 or even f4, creating threats and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. It's a quiet, positional move that sets the stage for future action, a classic example of building a strong defensive and offensive network before committing to a direct confrontation. The bishop finds a more active diagonal, aiming to pressurize the kingside and potentially prepare an advance on the kingside after the central tension resolves. Suddenly, the knight embarks on a daring safari towards the white king's flank, a bold redeployment aimed at disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially creating outposts on the kingside. This maneuver immediately questions the long-term stability of white's pawn shield, especially the vulnerable g3 pawn, while hinting at future tactical skirmishes. The knight's journey from the cramped kingside to the more active e4 square signals black's intent to seize the initiative and inject dynamism into what has been a rather positional struggle. Consider the ramifications of this piece transfer on the open diagonals and potential discovered attacks it might facilitate as the game progresses. Preparing to double rooks on the b-file is a solid positional endeavor, aiming to exert pressure and potentially break through on the queen side, especially if black's pawn structure remains somewhat static. However, it somewhat neglects the central struggle and king's safety for a moment. Unlocking the queen from its passive post, this maneuver immediately contests the central d4 square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and create active counterplay on the queen side where white has focused development. A necessary retreat, safeguarding the monarch from the burgeoning central pressure and potential harassment on the king side. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the king side and potentially reinforcing the queen side advance. Pushing this pawn forward aims to cramp black's queen side development, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses on that flank, while also challenging the bishop on f5 and opening avenues for the rook on b2. Black's bishop now eyes the king side, seeking to exploit the slightly exposed nature of white's monarch and challenge the control over the dark squares. Opening the h-file with a pawn sacrifice creates immediate tactical possibilities and shifts the focus of the game. White is essentially forcing a confrontation, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king now that the h-file is open. This aggressive play, while potentially exposing white's own king, signals an intent to seize the initiative and test black's ability to defend under pressure. The open file now beckons, a new landscape for maneuvering the rooks, aiming to destabilize the enemy's monarch. Unleashing the rook opens a direct assault route on black's king, aiming to penetrate the kingside defenses that have been so carefully constructed. A surprising knight sortie disrupts white's kingside setup, forcing a difficult decision that could expose the monarch to immediate danger. Opening the diagonal for the bishop, this capture decisively eliminates a dangerous knight poised to disrupt the queenside and creates immediate attacking potential. Opening a critical central file and exposing white's king is a bold maneuver, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing white to defend. The monarch's repositioning, driven by the immediate threats swirling around the king's former quarters, seeks a measure of safety. The bishop sacrifices itself here, aiming to dismantle the pawn shield protecting the white king and open aggressive lines for black's remaining pieces. Exposing your king to a storm of black pieces, a perilous gamble taken to dissolve the immediate mating threats, the pawn structure now fractured, creating a dramatic imbalance. Securing the king with a timely repositioning, black's monarch strategically retreats from the newly opened diagonals, seeking refuge behind a more solid pawn structure before white's attacking pieces can fully exploit the weakened kingside. Exploiting the compromised dark squares around the black king, this advance seeks to break open the kingside for a decisive attack, potentially creating an open file for the rook or queen. The black king, though still in the center, now finds a vital escape route opening up along the now cleared h-file, creating immediate attacking potential as the rook ventures forth. Unleashing a decisive check, white gambits the bishop for immediate king disruption, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and expose the monarch to a deadly, open royal diagonal. Sacrificing material to break open the king's defenses often leads to a desperate fight for survival, and this exchange, while seemingly forced, opens a dangerous diagonal towards the enemy monarch. The rook's ascent to the 7th rank initiates a decisive confrontation, promising to pry open the kingside for a swift, brutal conclusion. Exposing the monarch so dramatically on the h-file, black initiates a desperate exchange sequence, hoping to disrupt white's advantageous pawn structure and perhaps find some counterplay in the chaos, though the long-term implications for his king's safety are starkly uncertain. Unleashing a potent check, white immediately targets the exposed black monarch, forcing a critical decision in this materially unbalanced position. The game has dramatically shifted from positional maneuvering to a sharp, tactical confrontation, where the safety of the king dictates the pace. White's queen, having abandoned its defensive post on d2 earlier, now reappears to exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. The immediate goal is to disrupt black's already compromised defensive structure and potentially create further weaknesses. This sudden attack, appearing after a series of strategic pawn advances and exchanges, injects a surge of urgency into the proceedings. Black has just sacrificed a piece to open lines and expose the white king, but now aggressively pushes the g-pawn, seeking to create a passed pawn and further destabilize white's position. This pawn push, while seemingly active, also weakens the dark squares around black's own king, potentially offering white counterplay if the immediate attack falters. Unleashing the pawn storm by capturing on c6 fractures black's pawn structure, opening the b-file for immediate infiltration, and creating a precarious outpost for the white queen. Black's queen dances back into the fray, a calculated risk to reclaim the pawn on f5 and maintain some semblance of attacking pressure against the exposed white king. The immediate pawn gain might look tempting, but it neglects the developing tactical skirmishes around the kingside. White's pawn on c5 now forms a formidable barrier, and the exchange of pieces that is likely to follow will primarily benefit white's cleaner pawn structure and more active queen once it's liberated. This aggressive recapture risks overextending black's forces and leaves them vulnerable to white's well-positioned pieces, particularly the rook on b2 and the bishop on d2, which are poised to exploit the open lines and weaknesses. The knight's journey back to the center aims to reinforce white's cramped position and contest the d-file now that black's queen actively patrols it. Black's queen boldly advances to the kingside, eyeing the exposed white monarch and threatening to unravel white's defenses on the central files. Reclaiming the central files, this knight hops into the action, aiming to disrupt black's unleashed queen and the exposed king. Dragging the king into the open, a desperate attempt to find safety, But this maneuver might just expose it further to the relentless pressure white is building on the king side.